second session this year. We're going to have one a month, so we hope that you will find these really beneficial. Today's is a very popular topic, budgets and fiscal monitoring. We know some of you have been around for a while, so this may be a refresher. Some of you may be fairly new to your positions, so this might be some new information. So we hope it's helpful. We are joined today by two of our early childhood principal consultants, Alicia Lynch-Dethridge and Valerie Keller. And we're also joined by a principal consultant in federal and state monitoring, Tina Schwartz. So thank you for all being here. And Valerie, I think you're taking it away.
It's me. Okay, so welcome. We'll begin with our next slide. Okay, oops, let's go back one. First, we'll start with budgeting. Budgeting is a project plan in which ideas, goals, and objectives are translated into expenses that are segregated by function and object per ISBE Part 100. The budget is of equal importance to the narrative and can be approached as an important financial check in clarifying the practical application of the program. Careful deliberation should go into completing the budget section. No budget when submitted can be more than an informal estimate of the cost to be incurred, but careful budget planning will ensure that the financial support requested will be adequate to carry out the goals of the project. The approved budget connects the proposed expenditure to the program activities and objectives. All activities and obligations that will be charged to the approved grant must incur within the project begin and end date. So
Valerie, before you continue, I just realized I forgot to mention about questions. I know you will have questions and we're going to do those at the end. So if you can put them in the chat. If your question for some reason does not get answered, we ask that you send it to earlychi at isbe.net and someone will get back to you. Sorry, Valerie, go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Jenny. Okay, so establishing a project start date. In general, grantees are not allowed to begin an activity or obligate or expend funds that would be charged to a state or federal grant until a substantially approvable initial application has been received. Grantees that submit a state or federal application prior to the begin date will be granted an appropriate project begin date. This is typically found on the overview page of the e-grant. Next. Okay, so our budget detail. The budget detail page is required and should be completed by providing an itemized, detailed description of the expenditures and their costs. All expenditures must be budgeted to the appropriate function and object codes. Key points to properly completing the budget detail page includes itemized detail with an expenditure description and itemization box with itemized total costs equal to the expenditure totals. And here's an example with utilities, the water and the sewer service, September to May for preschool building, $175 per month times 9 months equal $1,575. For salaries, you see the FTE full-time equivalent, the staff title, the staff name, and salary should be included. For benefits, list the staff name and itemize the benefit type and cost. And you see an example with J. Smith, 1,000 for medical, 1,500 FICA, 500 for IMRF. Now, function codes for preschool, for preschool for all and preschool for all expansion, they differ from those used with the preventive initiative grants. For the function code, here's some example. I'll just cover a few. We have 1,000 is instruction. 2210 is improvement and instruction. If you look at 2550, That's pupil transportation service, and it's not open to PI programs. Next. The object codes. Here we have 100 is salaries. We can go to 300, which is purchase service, amount paid for personal services rendered by personnel who are not on the payroll of a local education agency, the LEA. Object codes also include workers' compensation and unemployment compensation. And we can go to the next slide. And this is just 700, which is not used often. And this, you can read over this with the slides, is non-capitalized equipment. Next slide. Now we're going to talk about indirect costs. Now, ISBE has a delegation agreement with the federal government to calculate the rate of all LEAs, Regional Office of Education, colleges, and universities. Now, in accordance to the delegation agreement between the U.S. Department of Education and ISBE, and pursuance of the authority under the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act and administrative rules, the Governor's Office of Management and Budget has granted ISBE an exception to the Federal Uniform Guidance and GATA regarding the determination of indirect cost rates that may be utilized by all grantees subject to the delegation agreement that receive a state award or federal pass-through award for the grant program administered by ISBE. For indirect costs, these are costs that are not readily identifiable with the activities of the grant, but incur for a joint benefit of those activities and other activities of the organization. Costs incurred for a common or joint purpose, benefiting more than one cost objective. Not readily assignable to the cost objective specifically benefited without effort disproportionate to the results achieved. On this page, we're showing you the actual indirect cost. This is on your budget detail page. You will see your indirect cost rate. On this example, it is 9.33%. Number two, your maximum indirect cost on this example was $29,789, and your indirect cost amount goes here under where it says indirect cost, that is circled in red. Now, if you, this will show up on your system just like this. If you choose to use indirect costs, you simply make sure you type in this example, 29789. Don't forget to save. Amendments. All amendments must be submitted in IWAS and are due to ISBE 30 days prior to the project end date. Specifically, if a project end date is June 30th, the amendment is due by May 31st. A project with the end date of August 31st has an amendment due of no later than August 1st. Amendments must be received prior to the obligation of funds based on the amendment. Amendments are required if the scope of the project is expected to change. In this example, you're changing from the traditional program to a blended program, or a half-day program is extended to become a full-day program. The expected expenditure exceeds the budget code by 10% or 1,000, whichever is greater. The new expenditure needs to occur and it has already been budgeted, opening a previous unbudgeted sale, closing a previously budgeted sale. Additional funds have been allocated or returned on either a one-time or continuing basis. Amendments are not required if the end date extension past June 30th is not needed for regular term staff salaries paid on a 12-month salary schedule. An end date extension past June 30th is not needed to pay obligations. Example is purchase orders for supplies incurred June 30th or prior. An end date extension past June 30th is needed for new activities and obligations incurred July 1st or later. Example, summer school or professional development. Each budget amendment payment schedule replaces the prior one. Include all budget sales, even the ones that are not changing, and new payment schedule, even if it is not changing, on the budget summary and payment schedule. Application approval status. Sufficient and complete information must be provided on all pages, tabs within the PFA/PFAE electronic grant application. Once the application has been completed, the applicant should submit it to ISBE for review and approval. After review, ISBE will return the application marked with one of the following approval. It would either say return for changes or final approved. Again, return for changes or final approved. The application marked as final approved, go back one, yes, may have been approved on the condition that certain issues within the application has been addressed in a timely manner. Upon receiving a final approved status, the applicant should go to the amend page and view the approved status section for any comments and or changes needed to the application information. If changes are indicated, the applicant should return to the applicant sheet page and click review checklist for more details. Applications returned from ISBE with an approved with condition status will need to be omitted and resubmitted. Please make sure you do that within 10 days. Now, what is not allowable on the Early Childhood Block Grant? Expenses to graduation, promotions, itinerant services provided by special education staff. These expenditures should be covered by special education funds. Compensation for principals, assistant principals, superintendents, directors of child care centers, etc., must use as indirect costs. Vehicle purchase, building purchase, or any other permanent structure. Rent may be allowable if there is a need for space that is not already owned by the district or fiscal agent. Staff tuition reimbursement, capital construction, renovation, modernization, or other facilities related activities. And now we'll go to Alicia.
I'm going to take over and talk about the reporting requirements.
Okay.
Next slide. Yep. One of the reporting systems that you'll need to have added to your IWAS account is the Employment Information System. So this is an annual data collection that you will list all your licensed staff in. This will apply to community-based organizations or anybody with an early childhood block grant. So we've listed out the user manual and pointed out where you can find more information regarding this system and who you would contact if you incur any issues. So we talk a lot about the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act. The purpose of the GATA is to increase accountability and transparency in the use of grant funds while reducing the administrative burden on both the state agencies and the grantees. So if there's any updates to the GATA processes and procedures, we've provided you with the link there to the GATA webpage. But another system that you'll be required to report in is the Grant Periodic Reporting System. So the periodic performance reports are required for all grants administered by the state of Illinois to assure they align with GATA. The reports include information on accomplishments of deliverables described in the grant, the status of their performance measures, and the alignment of accomplishments to date with the spending. So for in 2023, the reporting requirements changed. Most grant recipients are required to only report annually. Some may be required to report semi-annually due to the findings of elevated program risk. ISBE's Early Childhood Department does require a supplemental form that is to be filled out and uploaded into the GPRS system via IWAS. So we've provided you with the link where you can find the forms. The student health data. So the student health data consists of 4 main collections: immunization and physical exam, eye exam, vision, dental exam, and physical fitness. We've provided you with links to the website, and there are webinars that can give you a little bit more information about the reporting requirements, business rules, and the deadlines.
This is the early learning part of the student information system. So all of our programs, regardless of funding sources, are required to enroll and exit children continuously throughout the year. So when you go to ISBE.net, you type in SIS, early learning, you'll see the strand of all of these resources. Most of them are the data elements and the indicators. And we did post, I think it would be next slide. No, okay, I'll go back. Sorry about that. We did post technical assistance webinars, and I think they're the couple slides ahead, but let me go ahead and start here. So this is new, and this is the behavior support and program transition system. So this was adopted at an amendment for early childhood programs effective in January of 2020. So it applies to exclusionary discipline in early childhood programs that receive early childhood block grant funding. This exclusionary discipline amendment is composed of a behavior support plan and a program transition plan, and the annual reporting requirements based on these plans. So in SIS, if needed, programs will need to fill out a behavior support plan that is agreed upon by staffing and parents and a qualified professional resource designed and targeted to provide that child with support for repeated patterns of challenging behavior. The program transition plan comes after the behavior support plan, and it's an individualized, written, and culturally and linguistically appropriate document developed by the departing and receiving early childhood program. So if a child needs to be transitioned out into another program, we need to make sure that we have that piece in, that the child is leaving program A and moving into program B. Here's the SIS webinars. So we have technical assistance webinars, and they're available on the Early Childhood Student Information webpage under the Early Childhood tile. We did record prenatal, birth to 3, the behavior and transition system, and the new pre-K 3 to 5 indicators with programs and providers. Also, these are also the helpful data element links. Of course, we've got the demographics, the enrollment, the indicators. We've got the matrix, birth to 3 indicators, caregiver demographics, well child visits, prenatal, and the behavior support and transition plan manual. Another reporting requirement, electronic expenditure reports. So electronic expenditure reports are utilized by ISBE primarily as a program accountability and cash management tool. Most of state grants have a payment schedule, but all grantees regardless are required to do minimum quarterly expenditure reports. Now you can do them more often, but they are required minimum. Here are the dates for the upcoming year. The electronic expenditure reports. It looks like we've already hit report 1. It was due in the office October 20th. Report 2 is January 20th. The third quarter is April 20th, and the final will be due July 20th, but that could be extended out depending on your program's end date. I'll turn it over to my good friend, Tina.
Okay. Can everyone hear me and see me? Okay. You've already been, they've already talked to you about the budget, and Alicia just talked about the expenditure reports. So basically, from my perspective and where I get involved is after all that stuff is done. First off, you tell everyone that you're going to spend the funds and what you're going to spend it on. In the expenditure report, you state how many dollars you spent in those different categories based on the budget. Before we go any further, just so that you know, the presentation will be available by video, but we will also be sharing the slide deck. Some of the slides that I have do reference code specific as to why we do what we do or what we reference off of. Everything we do from the financial aspect is based on federal code, which applies to the state grants also. So when I come in, which potentially I could come in and see any one of you, we are coming in to do a fiscal review, and we are looking at more detailed documentation that you have not presented to us. When you do a budget, we're just seeing the verbiage and the numbers. When you do an expenditure report, we're just seeing a total number of dollars that you say that you spent. Now, when we come in, we're coming in to look at more detail. How did you come up with that number? What did you spend those dollars on? So if you get a letter from ISBE saying we're coming in to do a monitoring review, here's what you're going to need when we come in. The first thing we're going to ask for is your financial records. We're going to be looking for a detailed general ledger, or if you're using QuickBooks, it's called a transaction list. We will be asking to see your purchase orders if you use those, your actual vendor invoices. You potentially could be asked to provide your bank reconciliations, bank statements if asked. Not always do we ask for those. If you have an inventory list of capital items, we'll be asking for those, and copies of your policies that you may have on file for fiscal purposes. Next slide. We also ask for payroll distribution documentation, possibly looking for your timesheets or teacher class schedule. In addition to your time and effort documents, which we'll talk about here in a minute to be more specific on those. Make sure you keep any of your notes that you use when you do your expenditure reports and any documentation that you might use to do those expenditure reports, so that if you made any modifications or you had to add a couple of different things together to come up with the amount you put in there, so that you don't have to go back and figure out where that came from. Because the first thing we're going to do is try to tie your financial records back to what you submitted in that expenditure report. Next slide. Per federal code, as I had noted, this is the code that specifies the reason why you have to have all these things. You must be able to provide sufficient information to permit the preparation of the reports required for general and programmatic specific terms. Basically, you need to be able to account for the use of the grant funds separately from any other expenses you may have within your school district or organization, so that we can easily identify the use of the grant funds from anything else. Next page. You must have records that identify adequately the source of the use of the grant funds, and you must have effective control and accountability for all funds, property, and other assets associated with the grant funds. These things must be available to us when we come in. Financial records must separate the costs, as I noted, between services. So there's a lot of grantees who receive possibly all 3 or more grants from our agency, and you receive funding from other locations such as Head Start directly from the federal government, possibly other local grants you may receive. You must be able to easily identify those costs between maybe your PI grant, Head Start, pre-K program, any other funding sources. If you're a daycare center, you may have other classrooms that you receive funding for, but they're not associated with the grant. Those costs need to be separated. You must be able to easily compare the actual cost to your budget that you for your grant award, if at all possible. So if you're not familiar with the general ledger or your transaction detail report, and you're not sure exactly what report that is a report that should be able to tell us the transaction date, the the type of transaction it was. Did you make the payment with a check, a credit card? Was it processed through payroll? The name of the vendor or the employee who was paid, the amount of the transaction, and sometimes there's a memo that says it was for classroom supplies, software purchase, so forth. That's what we're looking for when we're looking for a detailed transaction report. The types of supporting documentation that we'll be asking for, and you are required to keep this on file, and it can be electronic or in paper format, whatever works within your agency and how you choose to keep that information, but you do need to keep it. And just as a note, you do need to keep it for up to a minimum of 3 years. We can come in and look at your documentation for the previous 3 years. So that would include any purchase orders that you may have if you use those. Not everyone uses those yet at this point. Any vendor invoices, and not just a statement. You need to keep the invoice. If you're talking about receipt from Walmart, you should have that. If it's from a restaurant, it's not just the receipt that says the amount that was paid. It should be the receipt that says what was purchased at that restaurant. You may have that if someone's traveling to a conference and you're reimbursing them for their meals. You should keep the detailed receipt, not just the one that says you paid $50. Any contract agreements that you have for the services that you're receiving, employee payroll reports. You should have employee files that has their approved payroll pay schedule in it. We potentially can go back to the employee file to verify that they're being paid at the proper rate that was approved. Any timesheets or time and effort documents that might be available, and cost allocation plan. You are required to have a written cost allocation plan if you do any allocations of any of the costs. We will go through that in a little bit. So what is an allocated cost? They have to be specific to the award. Majority of the costs associated with these grants for early childhood are very direct, specific to the grant, and are very easily identified. But there are sometimes costs that are not easily identified, which was kind of mentioned earlier, something such as utilities. If the easiest one to reference is a daycare center that has the early childhood classrooms, there may be 2 classrooms that are for PFA, and then there's 3 other classrooms that are for just regular daycare center services. You may be able to allocate the cost of the utilities for that center based on the number of classrooms that are associated. So let's say there's 4 classrooms, 2 are PFA and 2 are daycare, so it's 50-50 cost. And you can identify that it benefits both programs. It also has to be necessary. So therefore you have to have a written policy in place that determines how you're going to do that cost allocation. It needs to be supportable and verifiable. This can also be done with the janitorial cost, cleaning supplies for that center. That's one way to allocate the cost if you're not using the indirect cost option to cover those costs. Next slide. As I had noted, it needs to be a written plan, and it needs to be clearly identify what it is you're allocating and how you're going to do that allocation, and then you're able to justify the cost or basis you're using. Next slide. Time and effort documents. This sometimes becomes a challenge for some centers to be able to do. If an individual is working in grant services and 100% of their time is associated with grant services, there is no question as to whether or not their full salary is allowable under the grant. But in some cases, the person may not provide 100% of their, spend 100% of their time on the grant services. This may be a situation where an individual works in a daycare center classroom and you're providing half-day PFA services in that classroom, and then the teacher goes to another classroom, provides services there, but the para or aide stays in that classroom all day. So half of their day is associated with the pre-K program grant, and the other half of their day they're providing daycare services. So those, their cost needs to be allocated for their salary and their benefits. So you should have either a timesheet, or there can be something as simple as what we consider to be a time and effort document, which I believe is on the next slide. Yeah, and it's specific. You can specify the date and the time range in which the services are provided. So that person always is providing 50% of their time grant related, 50% of their time is daycare time. They can state that from July 1st through December 31st that they provided that service. You can also provide class schedule to support that. And in that statement, the employee signs off and says, yes, this is what I did. The supervisor signs off and says, yes, this is what I did. You should put the date on there when everybody's signing off and approving and agreeing to that document. And that is sufficient if you do not use timesheets. If you actually have a timesheet system, you can go to the next slide. That just specifies what I just said. If you do have timesheets and those timesheets specify the service that's being provided, those are beneficial. If the timesheets are just, this is the time I started today and this is the time I left today, but there's no specification between the different services, then the additional documentation is needed to support your allocation. You can go to the next slide. Equipment inventory listing. If you buy any equipment that is $500 or more, or if you have your equipment policy states a higher dollar amount for your capital items, they need to be listed on an inventory listing sheet. The federal code states that any item that's $5,000 or more must be on this list. So for a lot of the early childhood programs, most of the stuff that's being purchased is less than $5,000. But the one thing that I do see more often now is playground equipment. If you're buying playground equipment and using grant funds, that is an item that is over $5,000. It needs to be on that list as to when you purchased it, and it needs to include all the information that is listed here. And if you have the proper equipment policy in place, all this information will be included in that policy also. So you are required to have that on the list. If there's anything else that you purchase that's over $5,000, it should be also included. And you do need to do a physical inventory every year to make sure that those items are still in existence. You can go next slide. So what exactly are we checking for when we get out there? One, were the funds were actually spent, and were they spent in accordance with the budget and the grant services? So it comes down to, you submit a budget, and in that budget you said you're going to do X. We're coming out and making sure you're doing X and you're not doing Y. And just keep in mind too, that you always have to have that budget submitted by the grant to have a grant start date. If you do not submit that budget, your grant does not start. If you have any changes and you're doing an amendment, easy example, like I mentioned, you want to get playground equipment. Don't order the playground equipment, then do an amendment. Because if you send in your amendment and submit your amendment, say you decided in February, we've going to have extra funds, let's do a new playground equipment. You can get a quote and find out what it's going to cost you for that playground equipment. You find out it's going to be $30,000. Now you need to submit an amendment requesting approval for that playground equipment. I would strongly suggest you get approval before you place the order, because if you order it and they come back and say, no, you cannot purchase it, now you're on the hook for that order and you won't be able to use grant funds for it. Technically, if you've submitted the budget amendment, you could order it. But if we come in and find out that you ordered it and it's on its way, or you've even received it and you haven't put the amendment in to get the approval until 2 months later or after it's installed, it will be denied, because you have to have prior approval for an item like that, and you purchased it prior to it being part of your budget. So the other thing we're looking at, did it benefit the program? something to be aware of, and that has come up somewhat recently. If you are a school district and you are buying a playground equipment to be put out at a building that is shared with an elementary building, and it's not in a separate playground area and it is being shared with the elementary building students, that cost should be allocated between the pre-K program and the elementary building, because the elementary students are benefiting from it. If it is, and you can't use the early childhood funds for the elementary playground, and you cannot put the playground equipment on the elementary building property if there's no daycare center, or I'm sorry, early childhood program, which is usually your pre-K classes in that building. I have come across that in a few situations where that has happened. And that gets back into, did the funds benefit the grant program specifically? Did you buy the things for the grant program that you are offering at the location that you're offering it? Was the cost actually reasonable? Did you pay a fair market price for what you purchased? Did you make your best effort to get the best price for the item? Is it allowable under the grant? Do you have the supporting documentation for the purchase? Did you, and as I mentioned with the playground equipment, did you get a proper approval for that capital outlay? And that would be anything $5,000 or more, unless your capital outlay limit is less than the $5,000. Someone's asking, do we need to go out for bids? That is the determination whether or not you need to go out for bids for items. It goes back to your procurement policy. And we will mention here briefly a little bit about policies we'll be looking at. So you have to go based on your agency district policy on procurement procedures. Should always be making sure you're getting the best price no matter what you're purchasing. Next slide. Policies, as we had mentioned, we are looking at some policies, and the first three policies listed here: personally identifiable information, property and equipment, procurement, which includes conflict of interest, are three policies that we are currently looking at because the federal government is coming in and asking, making sure that we look at these and make sure you have them in place and they're current and in line with the current federal code. We also recommend that you do have a travel policy in place to make sure that everyone is applying the same process procedure in reimbursing travel. If you have people traveling for professional development, in your PI program, you have your home visitors, and make sure everybody's being reimbursed the correct same way. With that being said, make sure that your travel cost is actually for actual travel cost. It should be for mileage, miles driven. You should have mileage logs. I've come across some situations that when they did the budget, they used an average of $200 a month for travel cost, and someone made the determination, since it was $200 in the budget, that's what everybody got every month was $200, regardless of the miles driven or whether or not they drove or not. Under this grant, all costs must be actual cost incurred, supported in a reasonable basis. So for travel reimbursement, it should be based on miles and a rate per mile. Most places use federal rates, sometimes some use lower. Do you reimburse for hotels? If so, that should be based on should be following the state travel policy if possible. But these policies we're going to ask to see. Most school districts have a press service that they use for these policies. But just so you know, I believe it was in 1819, the federal code was updated. So most places have updated their policies. The non-school district entities struggle with this a little bit to get these policies up to date because they don't have the resources that some of the districts have. Under the personally identifiable information policy, that refers to any information that you are collecting from parents, from staff, from your students, that could potentially be put together and used to steal their identity. So often it is considered to be just social security numbers, and that was the key thing that everybody worried about. Nowadays, with the internet and the combination of your name, birth date, and address, your identity could potentially be stolen. So this policy, it references what is considered to be that personally identifiable information, what information is considered to be publicly available, and how do you keep that secure? Who do you have within your agency that ensures that that stays secure? And what do you do if that information is breached? Your procurement and equipment policy basically specifies what is considered to be capital. It specifies doing your inventory, what needs to be included on your inventory list, which is all the items that I had listed in the previous slide. It talks about what do you do with that equipment after you no longer have the grant funds. Do you have to return that equipment to the agency, or can you continue to use it in your agency? It should continue to be used for its originally intended purpose for early childhood. There are some limitations if it's a high dollar item, such as your playground equipment that may be over $5,000. You may have to purchase it from the state because it was paid for grant funds. I don't know. It's going to depend on your individual situation. The procurement policy includes a conflict of interest statement, but it also refers to how do you go about making your purchases. There's small purchases for anything that's under $10,000. Over $10,000, you should have a minimum, you should have an adequate number of quotes. You should make your due diligence of making sure you're buying the item for the best price possible. And that's talking about an order of $10,000 or more. If you get over $250,000 for a purchase, which would get into more construction type stuff. And there are some construction grants out there, and this would apply to those too, that you go out for bid, you get sealed bids, competitive bids, and so forth. So that's all in there. So if you're not sure what to do, reference your policy. If you're a non-school district entity, you want to know what you should have in this policy. Our best suggestion is do a Google search. Anyone receiving federal dollars and the state of Illinois dollars must have these policies in place. So they are all over the internet. You can find all kinds of examples from school districts, from universities, private entities that have them publicly posted on their websites as a starting point. And then you modify them to what you works best for your individual entity. You may have something similar to it, but there is specific verbiage that has to be in there for federal code. You can also reference back to the federal code. Next slide. Common problems that we run into, not filing accurate expenditure reports or not filing the expenditure reports timely, because the actual dollars in your financial records don't match what you put in the expenditure report is often what the problem is. We are looking at that, verifying we're matching back to that. So if we can't match back from your financial records, which put you in your expenditure report, you will get that finding. Not maintaining separate general ledgers. If we come in and we're looking to find out how you spent the dollars and we're looking at supplies and there's the supplies for your whole agency and you're having to hunt and peck to find the items that were for the grant expenditures, that is not correct. I've had an entity say, well, how would I have known that I needed to do this? Just so that you're aware, in your grant application, there is a page called assurances. There's state assurances, there's several assurance pages. If you have not actually read those pages, I strongly suggest you do read those pages of assurances, because when you sign off on the grant application, you're agreeing to everything that's in there. And it specifically specifies in your grant application that you will keep and maintain records that separately account for the use of these grant funds. Having time and effort logs, there's no way to be able to determine what that person did if they provided more than one service and those documents are not available. Cost allocation plans are not available, or costs are not allocated on a reasonable basis. Purchases were not included in the original approved budget prior to the purchase. One of the things that I hate to see and we run into all too often is someone forgot to submit the budget and they submitted it late. So the budget didn't get submitted till October 1st. And that was the first time anybody submitted it. And we did not grant a late submittal date because of some hiccup we have in our system that gave you a grace period to do it later. And the grant starts on October 10th, but you've claimed expenses since July 1. Unfortunately, we have to disallow any expenses from July 1 through October 1st because you did not have a grant that was in place until July 1. So you can't claim any expenses until until October 1st. Please make sure you're submitting your budgets on time so that you get that earliest start date. Anything prior to that date, any service provided, any orders placed prior to your grant start date are disallowed. Same thing, any services provided after the grant end date or purchased after the grant end date, you will get a finding for. And if you wait if your grant ends June 30th and you don't buy any of your supplies until between June 1st and June 30th, because you were saving the money to make sure you had enough for all your other costs. And now all of a sudden you've got money left and you're going to buy all these supplies and you're going to use them next year. That is in violation of the grant intent. These funds are intended to be used for this year's kids, not next year's kids, not in next year's cost. You will get new money for next year if your grant continues. So make sure you're using the funds this year. If you've got money for supplies, buy it, get it for the kids, let them use it this year. Don't hold off till next year. That is the intent of the grant. So we'll give you a finding for not using it timely. We may not take the money back, but we will give you a finding for it. Next slide. There's a lot of resources out there. We have a fiscal policy if you can't access it, which is the first thing that's listed there. If you want to easily access that, you can go to our website, go to the search bar there and type in fiscal policy and it will pull it up. And make sure you get the one that was out. We have an old one that's out there, but there's one that was updated in 2020. Make sure you're looking at that one. It addresses a lot of these things that I just went over in the PowerPoint. We are always available to help you. You can always contact me or you can contact Alicia. And if it's not something she can answer, she can send it over our way. I am very fiscal, financially oriented. We do not do the program piece very much, but we may ask program questions to ensure that the cost that we're dealing with is approvable or allowable or part of the program. But don't be scared if you get a monitoring letter saying we're coming out to look. We're there also to help you and give you guidance because our goal is to ensure you're getting all the funds you should get for all the services you're providing. We're there as support in addition to reviewing what you're doing. So I believe we're ready for questions.
Didn't see very many in the chat, but you can go ahead and type them now if you still have some. There was one about whether benefits can be lumped for all employees in the same category of employment, or do they have to be broken out?
I mean, for our review, I know Tina has a different take on it, but for early childhoods, we want to see them line itemed out so we can count how many teachers are in the classrooms and the benefits according to the teacher's salary. So we would like those broken out.
What happens if the budget is submitted? Oh, it just jumped me. I can't read. I couldn't read it. What happens if the budget is submitted timely and the money is not received in time to spend it on this year's children? Sometimes it is very difficult to float the cost of supplies, etc., for several months.
That one I think is a little harder to answer because you know, your payment schedule is not something that we handle in our department. It's handled by funding and disbursements, and they voucher twice a month, and then they're sent over to the comptroller. So I know that you can see where your payments are at, but we can't expedite or help in that. Once it leaves ISBE, it's kind of in the comptroller's hands.
Will all grantees get a letter this year for financial review, or is it a select few?
I can answer that one. It will most likely be a select few. Just so that you're aware, there's only 6 of us that do what I do. We can only get to so many entities within a year. So there is a risk analysis that is done. So for school districts, it's a little bit different. If we're coming out to look at other grants within a school district, we will go ahead and look at the early childhood grants while we are there looking at the other federal grants that we're looking at. If it is a non-school district entity that we're coming out to, it's going to be based on a variety of risk analysis, some dollars received, any findings you may have had on your financial record audit that was sent in, and GATA has noticed that there's a possibly financial findings. I'm not even sure exactly what's all involved in that calculation, but it is only a limited number that we can get to in a year.
Thanks. Can you please repeat what is the amount of an item that we would have to keep an equipment inventory list?
That will depend on your equipment policy and the dollar amount you have listed in your equipment policy. If you did not specify what your capitalization number is, it's $500. If it's specified, then it's that dollar amount, but it cannot be larger than $5,000. Federal code states anything $5,000 or more must be on your inventory list. But if your individual policy has a lower number, then it's that number. We're going to base it on your policy.
Okay, next one. If the budget is submitted timely, but final approval is not received until a month into the budget period, are costs incurred between that time period allowable?
So I'm assuming I could safely say that the district or the entity submitted their budget before July 1st, but we, ISBE, didn't get it approved. So as long as we have that initial submit date, that's when you can go back and incur your costs.
And that is correct. As long as your budget is submitted and substantially approvable, but it could take you 6 months of going back and forth of getting all the details worked out. Your budget's approved, you can start spending the money. The only thing I often caution people on is don't buy that odd item that could be denied because it's out of the ordinary before you get approval on it. Otherwise, if it's standard costs, you should be fine.
The next 2 questions I can address. There's a question about cost of living increases for school districts. That's not something that we can address. That would be a leadership question. And there's also a question about COLAs that were mentioned in the last webinar. There were COLAs given to community-based organizations, and they were loaded in your e-grant if you are receiving one. So you can submit an amendment for that. Alicia, is there anything else on that one?
No, I think that one's good, Jenny.
Okay. So no crossing of fiscal years for BPD costs. What about conferences in which registration is open in a current fiscal year, but occurs in the subsequent year, like an early bird? Tina, I think we've allowed that before.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you should put it in your budget and state that you are paying for the professional development that will occur in the next year. Mm-hmm. Technically, according to federal code, it states that all costs must occur during the grant period, the grant start and end date. And in that case, you're paying for something you're going to do in a future grant year. But we have allowed it because it's a fiscally responsible thing, because you're saving money by getting a better price for the early bird, but you should specify in there that it's early registration for a conference in the future grant year. If it's something that's happening over the summer, possibly extend your grant year to the 8/31 date if it's something that's happening in July and August, and then it becomes part of your grant year. But if it's like something in October, then you can't do that.
Would staff monthly calendars that list home visits, trainings, supervisions be allowable as time and effort proof?
For time and effort, yes, but not for travel costs.
Salaries are reported on the quarterly reports. Our payroll is every 2 weeks. Should we be reporting salaries based on when they are paid or when they are incurred? A pay date may be in October for some time occurred in September, but time incurred in December may be paid out in January.
In general, the costs are based on actual dollars out the door, cash basis. If you're recording it before it's paid, it's considered to be accrual. That's an accounting term. One thing to state, because salaries can be tricky. Mm-hmm. When you have teachers that are providing services for 9 months, but they're being paid over a 12-month period. So the way the grants are set up, you should be claiming the salary for that teacher over the 12-month period for the grant year that they're providing the service. So we run into this a lot, and it can get complicated. So if they start receiving their salary for the fiscal year 23 services, August 1st, and they receive their final payment July 31st, that is the wages that you should be claiming in the 23 grant. Now, yeah, okay, your grant ends 6/30, but you have 90 days to pay the balance of those outstanding expenditures for any service received or items ordered prior to your grant end date. So that would be the case. So you'd pick up the salaries based on the payment period that you're paying the teachers. Same thing with any other staff if it's different than your grant period. Not everybody starts getting their salary for that grant year on just July 1. It will vary. So you have to take that into consideration. Yes, it gets a little tricky, but you have to keep those things straight. But that's the way it's supposed to be done.
There's a question about under what circumstances is out-of-state PD allowable? I believe that you need to check with your individual consultant on the out-of-state travel costs before you put it into your amendment. What about professional development that is started in one fiscal year that ends in another fiscal year? For example, it is a special certification training that has several sessions between May and September. As long as the PD is started in the same fiscal year that it was paid for, would that be okay?
I don't think we'd get too technical on it.
Right.
If it's paid for and you've started it and it was paid for up front, as long as you claimed it in the year that you claimed it. The PD is not as big a deal as some other things. You don't want to be paying for your, teacher, your gold subscription for the 23 school year out of your 22 funds. Does that make sense? Those are the things that we're going to look at a little bit closer. You can't use the 22 funds to pay for an online subscription for the next 5 years. You can only use it for the current year services. So that's one of the big things is the federal code states that the cost must be incurred during the grant period. So yeah, that probably would be okay. You should specify it in your budget. And if it gets approved that way, then it's a lot better. Anything that's approved in the budget, we have a harder time saying, no, you can't do it.
Alicia, is there a due date for the COLA amendments or just as soon as possible?
I would say as soon as possible.
I think that's all that's in there right now. Again, you can send your questions to earlychai@isbe.net if you have anything further.
I have something else I can help maybe clarify that was kind of mentioned earlier. and I did run across this recently with a district. The budget that you put in is not your cap or your limit as to the amount you can spend on the different categories. There is a variance allowance within the grants. You can, if you actually incurred a cost that was more than the amount you budgeted, and it is a legitimate cost, there is a variance of 10%. And that 10% is based on your total object code. So when we talk about object code, we're talking about your 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, which we're talking about total salary, total purchase services, total benefits, total supplies. So if you budgeted $10,000 in total supplies, but you spent $11,000, you can, if you have an extra $1,000 left over in one of the other categories and you haven't used it, because there's a 10% variance allowance there. And it doesn't matter whether or not that was in instructional supplies, facility supplies, general admin supplies, that can move around. The dollars can move around between those categories, the 1,000, 2,300, 3,000 categories, that can move up and down, but that can change. So don't leave dollars on the table because you think you hit your budget total and you're limited to the amount that's in the budget and you still have money left. There is a variance allowance. The system may not allow you to go over the budget amount until you get to your final expenditure report. Then you can put in those additional dollars if it gives you a limitation. But it's based on the object code total, not the individual cells. Several years ago, it was the individual cell limitation. Now it is based on the object code total. I hope that's clear as mud.
Yeah, can you, and I think Alma has a question in here. If you could just, I think you referenced it. If you could say it again, she's asking the expenditure will not allow to put in more than what is budgeted, but there is a variance. Can you say that again, Tina?
Yeah, there is a variance allowance, but the system kind of pushes you to add those variance amounts in at the end of the year in your final expenditure report. So if you have a significant change in your budget, I suggest you do an amendment and move the dollars where you need them to be. But you get to the end of the year and you've done your amendment, and then now you're in the last 30 days and you still have a slight adjustment, you can still put that in on your final expenditure report. It'll allow you to do it then. They want to make sure that you've spent all the money that you had budgeted in the categories, because you said you were going to. So there's an expectation that you spend those dollars where you budgeted it.
There's a question about an admin cap. We don't have a formal admin cap anymore. Consultants will look at that line and talk with the program individually if it seems high, but there isn't a specific admin cap.
That goes back to reasonableness. The last
Where
thing
could we access resources to create a budget that will last through 5 years of level funding?
I guess I really don't. I mean, can we clarify that?
Maybe send that question to Early Chai. That might be something we need to talk out.
Well, I think and I noticed another question earlier. I think we're just kind of looking to get some additional support on how to be able to keep the level of service that we have for students and families from year to year when these, for districts that do provide that transportation, it's just going up and up and up. And so between that and staffing, we're, cutting in other areas, or we don't have as full package of services that maybe we offered to families because we have to really focus in on the classroom versus, coaching and parent educators and those kinds of things that just have to be reduced when there's such a large increase in those costs to programs. So I just don't know how to build it off of a sum that we know is not going to change over that course of time.
Jenny, I think we'll take that one back to leadership.
Yep, good question. Is there a limit of how many times you can amend? No, as long as you amend for the 30 days of the project end date.
Mm-hmm.
Tina, Alicia, Valerie, do you have anything else you want to add before Susie gives announcements?
No, I would just say we're always here. We can always reach out to us individually in the early childhood department or earlychi@isbe.net, and somebody will get back to you. But we're here to provide support to all of you people in the field.
Just to follow up, we did follow up with the person individually, but the COLAs were loaded in the e-grant. If you thought you should have got one in your community-based organization, please email earlychi@isbe.net. Thank you, Alicia, Tina, and Valerie.
Okay. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. Just a couple of final announcements. Just to let you know, several of the links discussed today can be found at isbe.net. So we just wanted to note that. And then just a quick thing, if you signed in with a program name or just a first name, if you could just type in the chat quickly with the name you signed in with and then your actual name so we can confirm your attendance. And you will receive an email following this administrator forum session with the PowerPoint handouts as well as the link to complete an evaluation of this particular session for the evidence of completion, and also to provide ECPL and ISBE with comments in reference to this session. The recording of this session is going to be available on the ECPL YouTube channel within the next week. If you have not yet had a chance to subscribe, you may do so by signing on to the ECPL website at eclearningil.org. And the ECPL YouTube channel has recordings of all the ECPL provided PD for early childhood staff and administrators. And we'd also like to invite you to join us for our next administrator forum, which is scheduled for November 10th. And it is accessing supports for program-wide implementation of the pyramid model. And it will be from 1 o'clock until 2:30 p.m. And registration is currently open on the ECPL website for that particular session. So thank you again to our presenters, Alicia, Valerie, Tina, and thank you, Jenny and Cindy. We thank you for all of you joining us and your time and questions today. If you do have any other questions, you are welcome to type them in the chat room. Otherwise, you are welcome to sign up at this time. And thank you again, everybody. Yes, the slides will be sent as a handout in the email that you receive. Thanks, everybody.